Okay, everyone, so we're looking at Ralph Ellison here. As you read in the biography, Ralph Ellison was a hugely influential figure and a hugely controversial writer. The Invisible Man itself is a very controversial piece. Was during the time period that it was written in the 60s and also is still today because it critiqued a lot of the institutions which were in place to supposedly help better race relations and help better African American lives. Things like the Communist Party, the Black Brotherhood, all these different sort of parties and movements that were in place that were gaining followers by the droves. He really takes issue with these, and in the text he basically proves how these are just thinly veiled political machines, and they're not actually there to help the individual. They're there to help themselves and perpetuate themselves and their own power. And so that is a major theme in his text, is what is the value of the individual versus the value of the group, and how the group is not made to help the individual. So kind of think historically what's going on. We do have the communist movement, we have post-Harlem Renaissance, we have post World War II, we're moving into civil rights, we have a lot of things happening. So Ellison, he also was highly educated. He went to the Tuskegee University, which Washington helped found, and he actually left his senior year to go make money. He went in the summer to go make money in New York for his senior year, and he actually never came back. He was there to be a musician, so a jazz musician. He has a great love of music. You'll see it in here. But he never came back because he actually met Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son, and became really good friends with him, and his literary career just kind of took off, and he has always been a respected and revered figure in literature. So let's get to The Invisible Man. So I had you read the prologue because it really shows the major themes and ideas of the text without actually having to read the rest of the novel because it is quite long. So what I want you to notice is that how he uses the word I repeatedly. So The Invisible Man is from the first person point of view, of course, because the value of the individual is the impetus is placed on the individual here. And The Invisible Man is essentially about a character who, through a lot of thinly veiled biographical events which related to his own, Ellison's own life, comes to realize that he is himself metaphorically invisible in society as a black man. And so that's what you see here. It's a metaphor. It's not literally invisible. But by the end of the novel, he's gone through all of these different things, and he basically realizes he can try on different identities as this invisible person, and that's how he relates to the other races, and that's how he kind of survives in this very difficult society. And in the end, by the end, he's literally living in a manhole under the ground, and that's where we meet this character right here. So. Essentially, it starts with this great statement, I am an invisible man. It's very straightforward, strong, and that's the narration style. It's incredibly powerful. And he says, no, I'm not a spook. I'm not a phantom. I'm not something that's not real. I am real. I am flesh and blood, but I am invisible. And so he talks about, on page 208, how race relates to society and how essentially people who are racist see themselves reflected in his own image, and what they see fuels their own hatred of themselves. They don't like what they see, and that is reflected back on him in the form of violence. And we come to see that in the reaction in the encounter he has with the man on the street. But I really want you to notice his writing style. He's a modernist writer. He's playing with a lot of style breaks, a lot of stream of consciousness style. He kind of comes in and out of different states. He comes into a lucid state and a dream state and all these different things. So about the middle of 2:08, he says, I am not complaining, nor am I protesting either. So he's really pointing out that the way that he deals with this through his many, many experiences in the novel is to accept what it is and create a system of surviving. So he's not calling directly for a type of change in the vein of, say, Malcolm X. He's really doing more in the vein of something like a Martin Luther King Jr., where he's peacefully protesting and subversively protesting under the guise of coexisting in peace. And so what he says is sometimes an advantage to not be seen. And so he goes on to talk about how his identity is wrapped up in this in his invisibility. And he says sometimes it becomes too much. And he brings out this statement where he says, often you doubt if you really exist. So it's starting to affect his own sense of existence, his own sense of his identity. And he says, it's when you feel like this that out of resentment you begin to bump people back. So he's going to book in this argument about why does the violence in society happen? And he's saying it's not because I am inherently violent, it's because the violence is happening to me that eventually you have to push back. And so he takes action in response to this. And so at the top of page 209, he talks about the fact that society is to blame. So he has this encounter with this man in the dark on a street. And the man grabs him by the collar and he says, inflammatory language to him. And finally, this character has enough. He can't take it anymore. And he headbutts him and he starts beating him. And he's about to kill him with a knife. And he stops because he realizes the man is not necessarily a fault. It's not the individual fault. It's society. It's the institution. It's democracy. It's everything that has been built into our society from 200 plus years at this point that is to blame for the man's own ignorance towards him. So he stops himself and he says, and then he goes into this discussion of about the fact that he's not overtly violent. This is not something that is in his nature. And he goes into discussion about this battle he has with the power company, the monopolated light and power, which obviously is understanding of monopolies and corporate monopolies. And he talks about how he's stealing the power from them, and he takes us to the manhole that he's living in. And he is hyperbolically exaggerating about the lighting, obviously, but the imagery it creates is very interesting because he keeps playing with these ideas of dark and light, dark skin and light in the place. And he's literally taking from essentially what is the man at this point. He's taking from society what was not given to him as a poor man in Harlem. And he brings us back to that, and he talks about how a lot of this the electrical current, is disappearing from what he calls the jungle of Harlem. So he's giving us a sense that he's smarter than society. He's smarter than the oppression that is trying to keep him, pigeonholed into a certain identity. And he uses his invisibility to get what he wants. So he uses the fact that society ignores him to create his own success, essentially. And so he says, now that I'm aware of my invisibility, he lives what he calls rent-free in a building strictly written to whites. We know he's actually living in a manhole, but he's using this idea that he's appropriating from white culture what they try to take from him by silencing his own identity as a black man. He talks about how the society, the viewer should not pity him, essentially, in the next paragraph, where he's talking about what he calls "Call Me Jack the Bear," which again is a reference to Duke Ellington. And so we have a lot of call-outs to a lot of Harlem Renaissance figures and a lot of sort of major black artists and especially black musicians. So he calls out to Duke Ellington, and he calls out eventually in the next page to Louis Armstrong. And so it's very interesting on top of 210 where he has this discussion of light and dark. And he says, light confirms my reality, gives birth to my form as an invisible man. So in the dark, I am invisible because literally his skin, he's saying metaphorically and literally, I can blend in the dark. Light gives form to me. Light gives identity to me. And that's why he floods his living place with light stolen from a society and a system that is bent on keeping him down. Or really swallowing him whole, essentially. And he says, the light allows me to feel my vital aliveness. So we get into this beautiful language here where he's just talking about the vitality of life and the vitality. And we get a structure shift in just a minute that's going to kind of have to do with this. So the one line I really want to point out is that he's talking about the individual ingenuity and right of the individual to make his own life and purpose in America. And this is a uniquely American ideal. This is something we've been talking about since the first week of this class. And we know that it's not often true. We have this life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all people, but we've seen through all of our weeks that this isn't always true. It's certainly not true for African Americans or women or Native. I mean, the list could go on and on and on. So what he says is, I am in the great American tradition of tinkers. So he says, I make my own way. Because he talks about he could invent this gadgets that keeps his bed warm and makes his coffee in the morning. There's no limit to what he can do. And so he's saying, I am myself and my own maker. I make my own fate, not society, not these institutions surrounding me. And so he goes down, he talks about this album from Louis Armstrong. And he goes into this diatribe about how he was given a reefer, bit of pot, one night by accident. He thought it was a cigarette. And he goes home to smoke it and goes into this almost dreamlike state. And that's where the change sort of happens in terms of style. And this is where the modernist feeling comes in, where we're really kind of moving back and forth between different states of mind and different styles. And so he goes into this discussion of Louis Armstrong, and the line from Louis Armstrong is, he says, "What did I do to be so black and blue, so beat up by society because of my skin color?" And he goes in and he has this sort of imaginary state of being where he goes to this church-like revival. And in this dream state, he's talking about, the preacher is talking about what he says, the blackness of blackness. And they go into this discussion of color. And we have black and we have red. So red here is multiple meanings. It has meanings of being blood, as in vitality, as in life, as in I am alive and I'm here and I'm real. But also has meaning of red as in blood flowing, as in violence, as in being beat by society and by people in that society. And so we have this back and forth and back and forth. We have a call between the preacher and the sort of congregation. And it talks about blackness, preach it, and the sun, the blood was red. And so we have this back and forth where they equate blackness with redness. So blackness with being alive and blackness with being beaten with violence. And we have this colloquial language that's really important here too. He's pulling in a certain dialect that is unique to this society, and it's something that sort of is appropriating language away from white society. So they're saying, this is ours, this is mine, this is my world, this, you can't have this. And so he stops and he has this discussion in the middle of all of the state with this woman named Aunt Nellie, and she's saying that essentially her past, she says, she calls back to her slave past, and how he says, shouldn't you hate your master? Because she says her master is the one that impregnated her, raped her over and over again. And he says, you should hate that man, you should want to hate him, you should hate violence against him. And she says, no, how could I do that? Because he gave me my sons and I love my sons. So there's an interesting mixture here with sort of this understanding of race relations being connected. He's saying we're connected. Yes, it's a vile way to be connected. It's something that is, violent and horrific, but there is sort of a beauty in the fact that we are connected by this history. So it's a common history he's really invoking here. And then she says, what do you want? What do you love even more? Freedom. And he keeps talking about this idea of freedom. And freedom, he says, maybe lies in hating. And she says, no, son, it's in loving. And that seems to be one of Ellison's main tenets here, is that we should not hate our past. We should not hate one another, obviously. There's a societal problem that we can fix as individuals if we simply learn to connect with each other on that level rather than trusting in these institutions that surround us. Okay, so he goes out and he comes back out of this sort of dream state, and he says, he goes back to Louis Armstrong and puts the lyrics from Louis Armstrong in there. And he says, you sat there and you never felt this before, this state of being. And he says, it was a strange thing to hear the silence of sound. So this beautiful ironic dichotomy, the silence of sound. And he's trying to describe a sort of other state of being. And he says he never did it again because he said, I like staring around corners, but I don't want to hear around corners. In other words, I don't need that higher plane of existence. I want to exist in this plane as a real person, as a real man. So he sort of wraps up on 214 where he says, I've illuminated the blackness of my invisibility and vice versa. And that's a really important statement because he's saying, I've shown the world what is my identity. My identity isn't necessarily invisible. My identity is this identity as a black man, but society sees that as invisible. So it's kind of this vicious circle. No matter how much he tries to show his identity, it's seen as invisibility. And so at the end, he really goes to discussion of who's responsible here. He says, who's responsible for that near murder, the man that he almost murdered? He says, I don't think so. I refuse it. So it wasn't me. It wasn't the victim pushing back that is at fault. It is the person being the aggressor. And even more so, it's not that person. It's the social structures that are surrounding him that make him into the aggressor. So he says,
At the end, all dreamers and sleepwalkers must pay the price. So dreamers and sleepwalkers. Sleepwalkers are the people who are the beating people, who are the violent people. And he says the sleepers are, the dreamers are people like him. So he's saying everyone is equally to blame, and yet no one is to blame at the same time. So I hope you enjoyed that prologue. It's a really fascinating novel. If you are interested in this type of literature, I suggest you go read it. It's amazing. If you will go ahead and move on to the next assignment, let me know if you have any questions.